Here, outside Bethnal Green Underground station in London's East End, there's a memorial commemorating Britain's largest single loss of civilian life during the Second World War. This was the site of the Bethnal Green tube disaster. During the Second World War, the London Underground found itself pressed into service as a pre-made network of deep-level air raid shelters. The government were initially opposed to the tube being used in that way, but they eventually caved to public pressure. And, frankly, necessity. Soon the stations became something of a home from home. Londoners would camp out underground, taking regular pitches and forming little temporary communities. Better lighting, bunks and chemical toilets were installed. Entertainment was provided, but it was far from ideal. The stations were stuffy and smelly with no trains running through, and of course the presence of shelterers was disruptive to regular underground services. Nevertheless, an estimated 177,000 people took refuge on the network. Bethnal Green was unusual among the shelters in that it wasn't yet complete. The station was part of the Underground's New Works programme, a scheme to improve, expand and modernise the tube. Bethnal Green was an entirely new station on the Central Line extension from Liverpool Street. The war had called a temporary halt to the programme, but the tunnels were complete. In 1940, the station was requisitioned by the Air Raid Precautions Service. Having no track, the Central Line extension was perfect for other uses during the war. The tunnels further up the line would be turned into a massive aircraft factory, for instance. But what the East End needed was shelter. The East was the home of London's docks, and so was a regular target of bombing raids. So Bethnal Green found itself pressed into service. At the height of the Blitz in the years 1940 to 1941, up to 7,000 people would shelter there. But by 1943, people had come to take the threat a little less seriously. On a typical night, only around 200 to 300 locals would be found there. On the 2nd of March, though, news came through that there had been a heavy air raid by the RAF on Berlin. Londoners knew to be wary after such events, as they would often be followed by retaliatory raids by the Luftwaffe. Numbers taking shelter would typically rise until the threat was deemed to have subsided. On the evening of the 3rd of March at 8:17, following the alert, the still cautious residents of Bethnal Green began to head down into the station. They did so in a quiet and orderly fashion. By this point, they were used to air raid precautions. A system of ticketed entry was used, with priority for mothers and children. At 8:27, a salvo of anti-aircraft rockets were fired from nearby Victoria Park. It was a new and unfamiliar kind of rocket. Some of the residents outside the station, fearing the worst, threw themselves to the ground. Those entering the station surged forward. A woman at the bottom of the stairs with her child tripped. An elderly man was pulled down with her. Others followed, helpless to resist those still surging forward up above. In the ensuing crush, 173 people died of suffocation. The rescue and recovery operation took several hours, carried out by members of the police, the Women's Voluntary Service and the Home Guard. So tightly packed was the station entrance that they had to enter through a ventilation shaft. Queen Elizabeth Hospital was quickly turned into a casualty centre, although staff weren't informed of the true scale of the disaster. Incredibly, one of the survivors was a baby found at the bottom of the pile. For the first 2 days, reportage on the disaster was hushed up for morale reasons, although Rome Radio somehow managed to receive word and triumphantly announced that the disaster was a sign that the German raids had destroyed British morale and caused terror in the populace. An inquiry, not published until after the war, blamed a number of factors for the tragedy. The entrance to the station was poorly lit and did not have handrails or crash barriers. There was a general shortage of wardens and police to assist shelterers, and hereafter stations would have a police officer posted at all times. It was recommended that narrower entrances be built into tube stations to reduce the number of people who could enter at once. To categorise the disaster as the result of panic is to oversimplify matters and, honestly, to do a disservice to the dead. The exact question of what happened and why is still a matter of dispute, not helped by propagandists and official censorship during the war. What is known is that the Bethnal Green tragedy was the largest loss of life in a single incident during the war, and to this day it remains the worst disaster in the history of the London Underground. In 2017, the Stairway to Heaven was unveiled, a way to commemorate those who lost their lives on that awful night.